Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another webinar from CoolSet. Today, we will be talking about the ESRS updates. And I think considering that there are quite many people actually signed up for this webinar, and we launched it last week, I think what we have thought to be true has been confirmed that this has caused a lot of interest. We're seeing a lot of also, discussion around this in the various kind of bubbles that we're active in. So that being said, we have spent quite some time since it came out on the 31st of July looking into everything. And today we want to share some of those insights with you. So we're going to make it a very kind of a deep going session where we go through all the topical changes. Do of course note that we have 45 minutes. So for us, the trade-off was, okay, how deep do we go, and how much do we want to share with you today? So I hope we've prepared a session for you that will give you kind of a good mix between going through all the changes and giving you a good idea of kind of the detail of what's being changed, so that you leave today's session with a good understanding. Once again, please put all of your questions in the section in the bottom right in the question box, and we'll get to them during the Q&A at the end. Really briefly, I'm Jasper. I'm one of the sustainability researchers here at CoolSet, and I'm joined today by Freddie, who is also one of our sustainability researchers, and also has been spending quite some time on the ESRS together with me. So we're looking forward to today's session and explaining everything. So without further ado, let's move on to the plan for today. First, we'll go over a quick omnibus recap. Then we'll go over what EFRAG published. What does it actually entail? Then we'll give you a bit of a timeline on when it was published and what we're expecting going forward. Then we'll go over the high-level changes. Then look at the simplified double materiality assessment. Then we'll go over the ESRS changes and, of course, discuss what's next for you as a company. And then towards the end, we have the Q&A. Quick omnibus recap. So where do we stand today? The omnibus proposal now sits with the European Parliament. Of course, it was drafted, or it was put together by the European Commission. They have now sent it to the European Parliament, and a majority should be reached by September or October, which means that 361 out of the 720 European members of Parliament need to come to an agreement, which is not going to be that easy. So also what I wanted to note here is that the proposal focuses on CSRD, which is not ESRS. To quickly break it down again, CSRD is the scope, so which is the responsibility of the European institutions. So who has to report on CSRD and when? And ESRS is actually the actual content. So, and this is the responsibility of EFRAG, which is an organization adjacent to the European institutions, and they've been tasked with updating the ESRS data points, which will be the topic of today's webinar. We also recently did an interview with Jürgen Warborn, who is the lead omnibus rapporteur for the European People's Party, which is also the biggest party in the European Parliament, and he's leading this process. So we interviewed him in Brussels, and he provided some interesting insights that also shape a bit the conversation we're going to have today. And he, for example, mentioned that he wants to put the threshold at 3,000 employees, and that he is looking for any coalition to make that possible. He did say that his preference goes out to a pro-European coalition, but kind of the previous agreement that there was on working together with the Greens, the Socialists and Democrats, as well as the Renew Group, which are kind of all these all pro-European parties. He said that he's no longer very strictly bound by that coalition and is looking for other options as well. So what we're going to see soon is the continuation of those talks, because now the European Parliament is in summer recess. So when the beginning of September comes along, we're going to see those discussions come up again, and it's going to be a very interesting time, which will also be paired with some more of our webinars on the omnibus process. And the aim by Mr. Warburn is to have a final omnibus report by end of year, although insiders argue that this is unlikely given the process that is still required. So first, in the Parliament, they need to reach a consensus, which won't be that easy. Then it needs to go to the trilogue discussions, where the Council of the European Union, as well as the European Commission, give their final stamp of approval. And then it still needs to be transposed by the members of the European Union. So a lot still has to happen, but I think the step that we're discussing today, which is kind of the draft ESRS, is a big step forward and also a big step for clarity. So what did EFRAG actually publish? Here I'm going to give the word to Freddie, who's going to take you through the details of what was said and what was published.
Great, thank you. So on July 31st, 4 types of documents were shared. This is the 12 amended exposure drafts, the log of amendments, the non-mandatory illustrative guidance, and the basis for conclusion. And I will now talk you through briefly each one of those and what they each mean. To start with, we've got the 12 amended exposure drafts, and there's a document for each of the ESRS. And these are the revised mandatory disclosure texts, which will replace the 2023 Delegated Act. So this is where the bulk of the information is, and this is the new ESRS. EFRAG have reduced by almost 2/3 the amount of data points in these exposure drafts, and there's much clearer links to ESRS 2. So a lot of the information has been moved from the kind of separate topical ESRSs to ESRS 2 to streamline the process. These amended exposure drafts are now the central reference point for consultation and future adoption. And in terms of scope, the non-topical ESRS 1 and 2 drafts are in total 62 pages, with the topical E, S, and G ESRS 126 pages in total, so 11 each. And this is a significant reduction from the 2023 Delegated Act, which had over 1,000 pages in total, and now it's gone down to just under 200. And the amended exposure drafts have been accompanied by a log of amendments. And this is a paragraph by paragraph document showing the changes of each ESRS. So it shows the additions, any deletions, and movements of data points, namely to the NMIG document, which we'll talk about next. Each change here comes with a short rationale to explain the reasoning behind the changes and where or why it's moved. This document is structured in 3 columns: the original text, the amended text, and an explanation, and there's a log of amendments for each ESRS. And this is important because it allows stakeholders to trace the changes from the 2023 Delegated Act to now the amended exposure drafts, and it basically acts as an audit trail between the 2 different documents. Next up, we've got the non-mandatory illustrative guidance document, and this is a new category which is to be kept outside of the Delegated Act to avoid confusion. And this is a document where voluntary disclosures, application requirements, and examples have been moved to. So a lot of these data points or disclosure requirements are no longer mandatory under the new exposure drafts, and they've been moved to the non-mandatory illustrative guidance document to sit there as examples for those companies who want that extra context and support, but they're not obligations. And this message has been very clear from the SRB and European Commission that the NMIG is guidance, but not compliance. And finally, we've got the basis for conclusions. And this is a document that explains the reasoning behind the July 2025 amendments. So it's essentially a summary of both the stakeholder feedback from outreach and public consultation, but also a description of the 6 simplification levers which have been pulled to streamline this document, and it provides transparency on how the decisions have been made and why certain changes were prioritized over others. So it kind of brings together all these changes in a descriptive document and helps people understand. And I think this document is really useful for those who want to get involved in this public consultation, because it gives you a lot of context to why these changes have been made. Cool. And now we'll just talk you through briefly the timeline of ESRS changes, starting in July 2023, when the initial ESRS was adopted, forming the baseline for Wave 1 reporting. Come to February 2025, I'm sure many of you remember, this is when the Omnibus proposal was published. The European Commission proposed adjustments to CSRD and ESRS framework, causing a lot of change and kind of uproar in the sustainability reporting community. So from July through September, this simplification package is being and has been delivered by EFRAG. So this is what we're discussing today and what was published on the 31st of July, the amended exposure drafts, the NMIG, the log of amendments, and the BFC for public consultation, which the public consultation is open until the end of September. And finally, in 2026, we can expect the new ESRS Delegated Act. So this is when the Commission will adopt the revised ESRS after consultation, and this will formally then replace the 2023 set. Now over to Jasper, who will discuss the high-level changes.
Thanks, Freddie. Yeah, so now we have a bit of an understanding of what documents were actually shared. And as you might have seen, it has been simplified a lot, but still a lot of pages to go through. So hence also why today's session will be quite dense. But first, to give you a bit of an overview of the high-level changes that were discussed in this basis for conclusions document. So the EFRAG has identified 6 simplification levers, and they've done so based on the research that they've done from February until July, spoken to dozens of stakeholders. They've done a lot of interviews. I think they've hosted over 80 workshops. And of course, they've looked at the existing ESRS reports out there, of which I think there are now more than 1,000. So those have all been written with kind of the previous ESRS standards. And they've also looked, okay, what have companies done? What can they do, or what can we do to make that process more streamlined and to avoid, for example, also duplication? So at the end of that process, they've come with these 6 simplification levers, which will shape the ESRS reporting going forward. So first we have the double materiality assessment, which will be simplified. I think this will be a relief to those that have already started reporting on the DMA, because it is a really important step and it is super crucial to do this correctly. But some steps, as we also noticed, were just quite burdensome and also repetitive, and also not where I think the effort should be focused. So more details on that in a second. Second point here is that it's streamlined readability and conciseness. So I think this is also really important because previously the CSRD language was quite technical, and I think also therefore exclusive, because if you didn't have kind of a technical ESG background or spent a lot of time upskilling yourself in that field, it would be very hard to understand and you'd be very quickly kind of reduced to or you're limited to working with people that did understand. So hopefully this new language makes it easier for people to understand and also reduces the ambiguity of certain data points. Third point on the lever is that they want to restructure the general versus topical disclosures, which means that basically like the general is the ESRS 2, topical is ESRS E1 to G1. And here they said, well, we're going to actually put more in the ESRS 2 disclosures and have less overlap, because what we often saw is that in these topical disclosures, they would suddenly mention ESRS 2 and then say, okay, based on ESRS 2 SBM 3, report this data point in ESRS E1, for example, which was then not always as straightforward as the EFRAG might have hoped, I think, when they put this together. Fourth point is that there's improved clarity and accessibility, which is kind of similar to point 2 that I mentioned. And then point 5 is that they also have a revised burden reduction relief. So there's more focus on materiality in this case. So they want to make sure that companies only report on what's really material. And this goes very granular. So they can often do this on a data point level. And then the 6th point on the reduction or the simplification lever is that there's increased interoperability with the ISSB, but also with some other frameworks that we're going to discuss throughout this webinar. So some important updates that I also wanted to kind of bring forward is that the policies, actions, targets, and metrics disclosures are mainly centralized in ESRS 2 now. So companies that have these policies, actions, targets, and metrics should really disclose most of them in ESRS 2, which of course doesn't mean that the topical disclosures don't require any of this anymore. But it's more connected now to kind of the specific questions that they ask in those topical disclosures. So if you have a policy that relates to a specific question in a topical disclosure, then mention it. But generally, the kind of policies, for example, should be mentioned in ESRS 2 for your overall company. Also, if no policies, actions, targets exist, this must be disclosed, but this is fine. So it was also acceptable beforehand, but now it's that has been simplified a bit, and it's more clear that what the consequences are of not having any policies. You do need to kind of mention, I think, going forward that you will have them at some point. Companies can integrate them into their IRO narrative, these policies, actions, targets, and metrics. And metrics have been simplified with more flexibility, which means that you can use estimates and partial scopes. And that's also kind of a criticism going forward, because companies have mentioned that, having the granularity and the data quality be the same across the board is really important for comparability, and moving the requirements for data quality to saying, well, partial scopes or estimates are more acceptable than they were before. It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it makes it more accessible to report. On the other hand, it reduces the data quality and the comparability for investors, but also for companies. And of course, the last important update is that large reduction in data points and duplication across standards have been have been realized. So we're now seeing 66% reduction in data points, with some of them moving to the non-mandatory illustrative guidance. But the question is, how many companies will report on those voluntary data points? Quickly going over the simplified DMA. So what are the main changes? So we're seeing that the core principle remains. So impact and financial risks and opportunities, which we'll refer to as IROs throughout this webinar, are always considered as kind of a central element of the DMA, which was also the case before, but now even more so. The process is simplified, so you don't need to kind of put together these exhaustive checklists or flowcharts, which have also partially been moved to the non-mandatory illustrative guidance. And also the subtopics and topics have been updated, and the subtopics have been removed. So for those that have previously worked with the DMA, this might come as a relief. At least for me, it does. I thought that the subtopics just added a layer of confusion and complexity that didn't benefit anyone down the line. And the subtopics have been simplified in one way or another. So the core is the same, but for some topics they've been kind of merged or put in other categories. For example, the topic on water and marine resources is now just called water. So that's an example of how it's been updated. For another change, we see greater flexibility. So we also see here that proxies, indirect data, and judgments are more acceptable. And also just to note, this was acceptable beforehand, but with more scrutiny. So now when you go to your auditor with kind of the new DMA structure, they will be more kind of accepting of these proxy data points. And the aim, of course, overall is to shift from a compliance exercise to an outcome-focused assessment. So what does IRO simplification mean? Overall, the requirements for describing impacts, risks, and opportunities is simplified across the topical ESRS, which means that preparers now focus only on material IROs, not long lists in every standard, which also makes it more principles-based. So it's such that reporting aligned with strategy and business model sits at the core of the kind of assessment. Quick quote here that I wanted to share from the new ESRS 1. The undertaking may avoid unnecessary complexity. When an IRO is part of the business model, no further investigation is necessary to include or exclude them from the sustainability statement. So previously, you would have to kind of go through quite some steps to then still threshold it, still look at the scope and the likelihood. And now, when something is clearly related to the business model, you no longer have to put it through that process, which really simplifies a lot of the reporting. I also spoke to Wim Bartels a couple of months ago. He's part of the sustainability reporting board at EFRAG, and he also mentioned back then that what they're seeing at EFRAG is that a lot of the times these companies spend too much time focusing on IROs that are already clearly material, and spend too little time focusing on IROs that might be just at the border of materiality or not. And what this enables is that companies will have more time to focus on these IROs that kind of sit on the border of materiality. So they can spend more resources and time to think about those cases. Quick example here of DMA simplification in practice. I took an example from the banking sector. So here we see that for previously, companies had to document all possible IROs, even immaterial ones. And now they only treat clearly relevant IROs, or that they're embedded in the business model, which means that they're automatically material. So if you have IROs, that are just really clearly not material or don't have anything or don't have much to do with your company, but for example, might be mentioned by a competitor that's slightly different. Previously, you would have to kind of subject that to a thresholding assessment. Now you can say, well, it's just not going to be in the scope of what we report in this year. So also the second example here is that every IRO required a thresholding analysis, which is also what I mentioned before, is that now no thresholding is needed if an IRO is clearly material or clearly irrelevant. And the exception here is human rights issues. So that's the same as with the previous DMA. If it's a human rights issue, then you will always need to subject it to thresholding. And you also have to look at the likelihood of something happening, even if it's potential impact. Then the third point here is that reporting used to be focused on the process and the documentation. Now the reporting effort is focused on clear outcomes and strategy links. So it's really more outcome focused rather than process focused. And I think that's kind of one of the overarching themes that they had. Now you might wonder why I chose the example of banking sector. That is because I had some more examples in this slide, but I decided to simplify it a bit. So that the banking sector is not really relevant anymore in this example, but then you know that as well. Now we're going to get to the ESRS general disclosures. So what we're going to do now is basically go through every topic, starting with ESRS 2, and then go over to the topical ones, and we'll take you through some of those specific changes. Note, of course, as you've seen in what Freddie discussed, we had a lot of pages to go through, and what we've done is we've kind of selected some of the main changes per ESRS, just to give you an understanding of where everything sits, and also to give you a clear example within the log of amendments, so you can also follow the structure of the changes. So of course, it's not going to be exhaustive. I think for that we would need a whole kind of course and not just one webinar, but hopefully this gives you a good idea of where to look and where everything sits. So starting with ESRS 2 general disclosures, before on kind of the topic of value chain reporting, companies were required to collect a lot of data, often beyond reach. And now, after the amendments, the relief is that companies can use reasonable and supportable information, such as these sector or regional averages estimates, without undue cost. So that's, I think, a really important distinction there. For governance disclosures, companies used to have to collect detailed governance data points at both supervisory levels, often duplicating ESRS G1. And we're not just seeing this for G1. We saw this for all the other topical disclosures as well, that there will be an overlap between ESRS 2 and the other topical ESRSs, which is also why we're seeing that a lot of this has been moved to the ESRS 2. And now for the sustainability statement, we're seeing that companies used to have to report according to a very fixed structure with a mandatory full inclusion of Article 8, which is the EU taxonomy. But now we're seeing a lot more flexibility. So you can have more in your appendix, you can have more summaries, but you can also have subparts allowed. And you can also have an optional executive summary added, which I think will be a relief to those that have gone through these reports before and just seen dozens, if not hundreds of pages, and not try to figure out what, where the gist of the reporting sits. Now you can also have an executive summary as part of the reporting process. A quick example here that we took from the log of amendments. So here we see that this relates to disclosure requirements, SPM3, material impact, risks, and opportunities, and their interaction with strategy and business model. We're seeing that this was deleted altogether because it was related to repetitions. So basically, EFRAG did in this log of amendments is they just showed what they had, what they did, and then their comments. So in this example, they deleted it. You'll see in quite some of our examples that they deleted things, but they also, for example, sometimes amend things or update things. But we even have an example where they added a data point. Now I'll give the word back to Freddie, who will take you through the environmental ESRSs.
Great, thank you. Starting with ESRS E1, climate change, we can see three main topical changes we've highlighted here. The first one being the transition plan. So previously, a full transition plan was required with detailed pathways, multiple scenario options, which is quite a complex and time-intensive piece of information to collect. And now the changes are that it's been simplified. So companies are required only to disclose the key features of a climate transition plan, such as the headline targets, the main actions, and the timeline. With GHG targets, previously intensity targets were allowed and offsets could count within these GHG targets. And the scope has become much clearer with the draft amendments. Companies must set absolute reduction targets for scope 1 to 3 and offsets shown separately. Many stakeholders have a much clearer understanding of what composes the targets. And in terms of energy metrics, many granular data points were previously required, including energy intensity, and now this has also been streamlined, so only core data points such as total use and renewable share are required, and the intensity ratio has been dropped. In terms of an example from the documents, we can see on the left here that previously in 2023, under ESRS E1-2 undertakings, so companies were required to describe their policies in relation to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And you can see this has been crossed out in the 2025 amended drafts, and it's been moved to ESRS 2. So again, it's kind of this streamlining of data and moving core disclosure requirements to ESRS 2 rather than having repetition across multiple ESRS. In terms of ESRS E2 pollution, we can see firstly the unified scope. Pollution was previously split across air, water, soil, and indoor pollution was mentioned. And with the draft amendments, we've kind of EFRAG have unified the scope, so indoor pollution has been removed. Water pollution also covers marine, so that's been moved from ESRS E3 and it's now in E2, and any overlaps have been clarified. In terms of metrics, previously we saw kind of long pollutant lists were required to be reported regardless of relevance to the company. And now this has been focused, so companies only have to report on those pollutants which are significant to their specific operations. And the structure in terms of ESRS E2 was sometimes duplicative with other ESRS E standards, and the boundaries have now become clearer. Pollution issues are strictly covered in E2 with no overlaps. We can see here a practical example, E2 for pollution of air, water, and soil. Previously, companies were required to disclose information of pollutants and their own, and now companies are required to give kind of users an understanding. So the content and how it's delivered has changed. Rather than a dumping of information, it's companies required to give a more contextual understanding to stakeholders of their own pollutants. In terms of ESRS E3, water, you can see, maybe those who know the ESRS very well, it's changed from water and marine resources to just water. So the scope you can see has been narrowed. E3 is now only water, and marine topics are covered in E2 and E4. So again, kind of reducing this duplication across ESRS. And that's mentioned again, the removed duplication, it's just become a more streamlined ESRS topic. And often references have been moved to ESRS 2 to again reduce repetition. And finally, the water metrics have become more focused. So previously there were various different water metrics that could be used, including optional intensity ratios. And EFRAG have focused these metrics, focusing on total withdrawals, consumption, discharges, reuse, recycling, and dropping the intensity ratios. And a practical example we've pulled from the regulation is you can see here in 28A, total water consumption was previously required in meters cubed. And in the 2025 changes, you can see meters cubed has been removed. And the comments show that actually, whilst total water consumption is still required in meters cubed, this information has been moved into the AR, which is the amended regulations. And so it's just kind of a movement of data across different documents and streamlining where data is held. And for some, this is useful, but for others, it might actually prove more complex because now you have to go and look for the metrics elsewhere. So this is another change we see with kind of movements of data between documents. ESRS 4, biodiversity and ecosystems. Previously, a full biodiversity strategic plan and resilience analysis was required. And now with the draft amendments, this has been simplified and companies are required only to disclose the key features of the biodiversity transition plan. In terms of global alignment, EFRAG have moved the biodiversity reporting standards from being mainly EU policy oriented to more aligned with global frameworks for comparability. So this is really helpful for global companies who are reporting not only within the EU, but across the globe. It streamlines the reporting requirements in terms of biodiversity. And finally, the focus has been streamlined. So from broad and narrative heavy reporting requirements to more targeted data, such as highlighting the main biodiversity goals and initiatives. And an example we've pulled is that previously a company was required to disclose how its biodiversity and ecosystem impacts link to its business plan. And we can see here it's been removed. And actually you can see if you read into the comments that this information is now again held in ESRS 2 rather than ESRS E4. So again, that restructuring of where data is reported. And finally, the last environmental ESRS, E5, is resource use and circular economy. And we can see that the scope has been streamlined. So Previously, extensive disclosures, regardless of relevance, were required to be reported, and now they're only applied if material. So there's been a consolidated policy description, and again, no repetition. In terms of targets, these have been streamlined from detailed targets by waste type, hierarchy, and thresholds, and now they follow an ESRS 2 format, focusing on outcomes more than process detail. And finally, in terms of product circularity, before we had separate disclosures for durability, repairability, and recyclability, and now this has been integrated, so one combined disclosure for all key products. And from the regulation here, we can see previously a company had to provide a full description of key products, materials, and factors such as their durability and reusability, etc. And this has been completely deleted from the requirements and mentioned as being redundant. So we can see kind of a lot of this data information has been considered as not necessary, and again, just streamlining the reporting requirements and taking away a lot of this heavy in-depth work. And I'll pass over to Jasper for the social.
Thanks, Freddie. Yeah, so as you can probably tell, a lot has changed and a lot kind of to go into. So let's look at the social topics, starting with ESRS S1 on workforce. So what we're seeing is that in 2023, for social protections, companies had to report on each benefit scheme, such as parental leave, unemployment, health, and pensions, with detailed coverage ratios. What we're seeing now is that you only have one disclosure. So your company needs to confirm if if the workforce is covered by statutory or employer-provided schemes, and the details only need to be provided if materially relevant, which kind of brings me to the point that we discussed before, where we see that materiality really sits at a more granular level now, which, raises questions because on the one hand, it makes it more accessible for companies to report. On the other hand, it also kind of enables cherry picking of data that you do wish to report, which also weakens a bit kind of this mandatory element of reporting on certain data points. The second topic is inadequate wages. Before, companies were required to provide a full breakdown against EU and the International Labour Organization living wage benchmarks with supporting methodology. And now it's simplified, so the full living wage metrics have moved to the NMIG as voluntary guidance. For health and safety, we're seeing multiple metrics such as lost time, frequency rates, occupational disease by category. And for 2025, for the amendments, we're seeing that it's simplified to headline indicators such as lost time injury frequency, and then granular submetrics are voluntary. Here, I'm also, it's an interesting development. I think it is good that they have simplified some of these things, as I remember looking through these data points back in the day and being quite overwhelmed with kind of the scope and the granularity of some of them. But it's important to note here that it really is also a company-specific kind of exercise. So based on if your company, for example, has a lot of factories where health and safety is more important than at a, for example, software company, you need to determine whether these data points are something to report. So here an example from ESRS S1-6, which interestingly enough has been moved to ESRS S1-5, as one of the previous ones has been removed. So the data point here was that the undertaking shall describe key characteristics of employees in its own workforce. And this has been deleted because the EFRAG stated that they no longer want to have these introductory paragraphs, as these data points or these questions that they're asking are also covered by some of the other data points covered in ESRS S1 in this case. Moving on to ESRS S2, works in the value chain. So before, there used to be a clear link to ESRS S2, and you had to restate strategy and business model linkages already covered in SBM 3 of ESRS 2. Now we're seeing that duplication is removed, so disclosures now refer directly to ESRS 2, which is something that I think is an overall kind of recurring theme throughout this webinar, but of course also throughout the updated ESRS standards, that ESRS 2 is just a lot more kind of playing a central role in reporting. For the scope of workers, companies used to have to provide a detailed breakdown of value chain workers impacted, including per product and service. And now that is streamlined as well. So now all you have to do is confirm inclusion of materially impacted workers, where granularity is optional. And the third point is on the narrative burden. So this used to be quite lengthy with overlapping descriptions across S2 and ESRS2, and now it's quite focused with single reference points in ESRS2, and you only have to add sector-specific context if this is relevant. Example we decided to look at here is disclosure requirement S2-3, where the undertaking had to describe the process it had in place to provide for or cooperate in the remediation of negative impacts on value chain workers. So this was removed because the EFRAG mentioned that it was part of kind of the overall architectural decisions to streamline the text. I think this is corporate speak, but what I think it means is that they just decided that they needed to streamline, they needed to remove, they needed to simplify, and some of these things that are just too complex, too cumbersome, were then removed for the sake of simplification. For S3 affected communities, we saw that in 2023, the engagement process required companies to have a mandatory disclosure if no engagement process existed, including a timeline to establish one. And now we're seeing that the negative disclosure data point is deleted, which means less burden if process is not yet in place. For remediation grievances, we saw that separate disclosures from remediation processes and grievance channels were required. And now that's all consolidated into one requirement aligned with the UNGPs and the OECD due diligence requirements. And then we also saw that for training and capacity building in 2023, or with the previous ESRS, it was mandatory. There was mandatory disclosure on staff training, including Indigenous people's rights. And now that's all moved to the non-mandatory illustrative guidance as voluntary guidance. So it's also kind of raising the question, okay, well, staff training is very important. Is that something that you want to make voluntary, at least in terms of disclosing? So what we're seeing for S3-4 as an example is that the question on actions has been removed, and that's because the topical data point linked to GDR on actions has been simplified. So that's something that we're seeing across the board, is a lot of these data points on actions have been moved to ESRS2 or have been streamlined in general and are no longer part of these topical ESRSs. For ESRS S4, we're seeing that previously companies used to have to report on required disclosure if no engagement process existed, plus a timeline to create one. And here we're seeing the same as with the last data point, that the negative data point is deleted, which is less burden. For policy and objectives, each policy disclosure used to require companies to include a mandatory objective paragraph. And now these objectives have been deleted to avoid duplication with ESRS2. On the point of examples and narratives, we're seeing that companies used to be required to provide examples of consumer engagement, impacts, and remedies. And now the narrative data points have been deleted or moved to the NMIG, which means that they're optional only. Example here is from ESRS S4-1, which is on kind of the undertaking being required to describe its policies adopted to manage its material impact of its products and or services. And this has actually not been deleted, but moved to a new section as part of editorial and simplification edits. So if you go through the whole section of, if you go through the new draft of S4, you will see that this is still there, but has been removed from S4-1 and has been moved to another section. Moving on to governance, which is one ESRS topic, business conduct. Here we see that on anti-corruption and bribery, it used to be very narrative-heavy disclosures on mechanisms, plans, and whistleblower protection, and now it's quite simplified. So it's aligned with ESRS2 on policies, actions, and targets, and quantitative metrics on confirmed incidents have been added. On supplier relations, we're seeing that multiple data points on supplier practices and resilience used to be mandatory, and now that is streamlined under AR in G1-2 with redundant details deleted. And last but not least, on political influence and lobbying, there used to be extensive mandatory details such as registers, breakdowns, and examples, and now this has been consolidated and partially deleted with the overlap with ESRS2 Gov covered. Some items moved to the NMIG. Here, I think, a lot of kind of things to say about this. I think that one of the main reasons that ESRS was simplified in the first place was because of political influence and lobbying. So seeing that these data points have been partially deleted, I think for me is an issue for, it's a point for concern. And I think something that we should all be aware of. So as we'll mention towards the end of this webinar, do disclose, do speak to the EFRAG, do give your feedback, and if you agree that this is something that should be more critical of, mention that as well. Example here is that they actually added a new data point, which is that the undertaking shall disclose its business conduct actions in accordance with the provisions of ESRS 2 GDR-A, which is on actions. So what's next? What your company can do today. So as I mentioned, you can engage in consultation. So companies should provide feedback in the current EFRAG public consultation, which is open until September 2025, and you can do so as a reporting company. You can also monitor omnibus changes. So the proposal can still swing into several directions. As I mentioned, Jürgen Warburg is at the head of this, but once they'll come back from their summer recess, it's going to be a very interesting process. We're also in the process of setting up a webinar about this in September. So if you want to know more about it, then feel free to subscribe or to register. You should also strengthen your DMA process. So regardless of simplification, DMA will remain important also beyond CSRD, as DMA is used for a lot of other processes as well. And then, of course, the Stop the Clock Directive, for those that have followed the legal process more closely, you'll remember this. So basically, CSRD was postponed by 2 years, and in those 2 years, you can strengthen your foundations, and you can use the pause to improve double materiality and governance and data systems. Small note here, that 2-year delay applies to Wave 2 and Wave 3 reporters, with the Wave 1 reporters being the biggest companies having to continue reporting. How are we reporting for ESRS 2.0 at Coolset? So, of course, we're constantly monitoring updates from the EFRAG and the European Commission. And once the final ESRS is improved by November 30th, we will update our CSRD module as soon as possible. So already now we're talking with the team on blocking a lot of time in December to go through all the changes and update it accordingly so that our customers can start working on it as soon as possible with the new updates, having the certainty that they're working with the new module. We'll also streamline our DMA module according to the updates to make it more efficient. And of course, our in-house accelerators, which are these webinars that we organize for customers that are very practical, will set up customers for success. Also, something I wanted to share, we have a certificate of attendance. If you would like to show internally or externally that you have joined a webinar on the ESRS updates and you want to share this, we have a certificate that we can share with you. You can send an email to me at jasper@coolset.com, and I'll share the certificate with your name on it. And now over to the Q&A. So we have 3 minutes left. I think for those that have attended previous webinars, you'll know that this section usually runs over a bit just because we have a lot of questions. I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in. So yeah, let's have a look at those and see how many we can answer. I'll have a look at the question section. And once again, so what you can do in the question tab is you can upvote certain questions that you also want to have answered, and that will help us understand which questions to prioritize so we can answer them today. The ones that we don't get to, we'll try to answer them over email. So starting with the first question down here with 3 upvotes from Demetrius, what are the implications of if the European Parliament fails to secure the required 361 votes? In that scenario, how might businesses and companies be affected? So at some point, they will have to secure these votes one way or another. Either it's with a far-right majority or it's with a pro-European majority. The question is when that will happen. When that will happen can either mean that it happens sooner, so there will be more clarity for reporting companies, or it'll happen later in the year, so that there will be more uncertainty before companies with the certainty from the European Parliament and the Commission that they can report on ESRS again. I hope that answers the question. Here, question with 3 upvotes. Can you please give an example of what is meant by when an IRO is part of a business model? Yes, for sure. So I think a very, very simple example, which might even be too obvious, but Shell, for example, the oil and gas company, for them, ESRS E1 will, of course, be material because when they look at, for example, the impact on climate change, that will be very clearly part of their business model. Or when they say the proposed, what about a CO2 tax or a tax on oil in the next 5 years, that's very clearly part of their business model, and that's therefore an IRO that's automatically material. I hope that that answers it. I mean, there's a lot of variations of what can be part of your business model, but just think about, okay, how is my business model set up, and what does that mean for the IROs that I've identified? Let me have a quick look at the other questions here. Here, a question with 7 upvotes. Thanks everyone for using the upvote function. Will something happen if we draft a report for 2025 according to the existing ESRS standards? Is it necessary to simplify to comply with the new ESRS standards, or can we submit it in the form according to the current ESRS standards? Good question. You can report with the current ESRS standards. Also, they haven't been confirmed. It's still the draft until the end of September. And even once it's kind of been accepted by EFRAG, it still has to be accepted by the European Parliament and ultimately the Commission. So we won't see anytime soon that this is finalized. So you can keep reporting on the original ESRS and know that that's something that you can do for now. If you have more questions about that, of course, feel free to email us. Question here, I'm just going to prioritize a bit based on upvotes, seeing that we're running out of time. Let me move up. Here, question with 5 upvotes. So can you forward the slides to participants? The webinar will automatically be sent to your inbox. So the recording will be automatically shared with you. And that will, of course, also include all of the slides in the webinar itself. Should you want the slide deck, you can email us and we'll see what we can do for you. But you will automatically receive the webinar recording. Here, a question. So here, a question, I think, for Freddie. When in 2026 is the expectation that the new ESRS will be approved?
Yeah, and there's been no hard deadline here, that we haven't got a month or a date, but it's expected that in mid-2026 is the guidance we've been given, that's when the new ESRS will be approved. So as Jasper said, you should continue reporting, if already reporting, on the previous ESRS, and only once approved, the reporting requirements will start, I believe 2027 with an optional 26 reporting year.
Thanks, Freddie. And then here a question from Steve with 10 upvotes. What's happening with the EU taxonomy? Great question. So the EU taxonomy is also part of the omnibus and essentially used to be in the same scope as CSRD, but now that's been moved up. So while we don't know the final scope yet, we already know that EU taxonomy is going to be in a bigger scope. So they're saying that it needs to be companies with a turnover of at least 450 million euros, whereas for CSRD, that's still, I think, much smaller turnover. I always get them mixed up, but it's either 25 or 50, and the other one is, one of the other ones. Sorry, I'll have to look that up. But anyway, so what we're knowing is that it's going to be the scope's going to be a lot bigger. And it also, they've also provided already kind of an overview of how it's going to be simplified. And it's going to be a lot easier for companies to report on EU taxonomy because, for example, there's going to be a materiality threshold for these eligible activities. So that, for example, previously a company had to report on any eligible activity and then disclose how much OPEX, CAPEX, and turnover went to those activities. But now there's a materiality threshold of 10%. So any kind of activity where less than 10% of your CAPEX, OPEX, or turnover flows, you don't have to report that under EU taxonomy. Also good to note is that you can use that new reporting framework starting next year, but you can also wait for the year after to start using that. So that's up to you as a reporting company. But so short answer, it's not directly part of your scope anymore. One more question, I think, as we're quite short on time. I think here a question from Dimitrios with 5 upvotes is the guidance shared a few days ago. It is mentioned that reported information should be at either the topical level or at the IRO level. Could you clarify what this means and how it should be applied in actual reporting? Let me just quickly get through that question again. It's mentioned that reported information should be at the topical level or at the IRO level. So if I understand your question correctly, what I've read in the ESRS statements and the new ones is that there is kind of more of a distinction between IROs and topical disclosures at this point, mostly because these IROs can be linked to the ESRS, for example, policies, actions, and targets, but policies, actions, and targets are per default now included in ESRS 2. So the IROs really enable you as a reporting company to pull in certain elements of your company's reporting into the more granular elements of the topical disclosures. I'll spend some more time looking into this question as well, because I have seen it as well, and I hope that answers part of your question. But yeah, good question, and I'll look into it a bit further. Apologies to all of the questions we didn't answer. What we always do after the webinar is we go through all of the questions and we try to reach out to everyone with an answer. So rest assured that we will get back to you over email with an answer. Yeah, for now, thanks everyone for attending. If you do have further questions afterwards, feel free to send an email to either Frederica@coolsta.com or Jasper@coolsta.com, and we're very happy to help you. Yeah, get set up with the new ESRS. Yeah, thanks everyone, and see you during our next webinar. Bye-bye.